Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Welcome to the Oceanside Public Library. My name is Monica Chapa-Domerk. I am the principal librarian here at the Oceanside Public Library. Welcome to our program, the first 150 years of history of Oceanside. The library is really thrilled to be celebrating 125 years of Oceanside's incorporation this year. And we planned several events with our historical society, the Oceanside Historical Society. We'll be doing programs throughout the year. This is the second one we'll be doing because we're also participating in an Oceanside photo history project with the Oceanside Historical Society that we're really excited about. We're asking people to let us borrow for scanning your photos of Oceanside, and especially old photos of Oceanside places and people. So that's one program that we're doing that we'll be doing throughout the year, which will be culminating in September. This program is very special because it's the first in our history series. We're excited that Christy Hawthorne, Oceanside's historian and president of the Oceanside Historical Society, will be giving you an idea of what Oceanside was like in the first 50 years of its existence. Christy's really a treasure. If you don't know her already, you're in for a treat because she's someone that's super passionate and enthusiastic about learning and preserving Oceanside's history. She's a real gem and a treasure for all of us, so please enjoy the program and welcome.
Hi there, folks. Thank you for coming, and thank you for your interest in Oceanside history, because it's my favorite subject. I have been the president of the Historical Society for I don't know how long, not that long, but I want to introduce my board. John Daly, he's the vice president. John, you might know John. He's a Oceanside native and owns the 101 Cafe. He's the one I blame for getting me involved in the Historical Society, and now it's my favorite addiction. I'd like to introduce Ronnie Ellsbury. She's our corresponding secretary. She does the newsletter, and Janice Ulmer is our membership chairman. And Carolyn Wright. Where is Carolyn? Oh, there's Carolyn Wright. She's our recording secretary. If you've been to one of my programs, chances are you're going to see some of the photos. You've seen them before, but I have added a number of new ones because we're always building on our collection, and maybe if you've loaned us a photo or two, you might see that photo. I'm always thrilled to get photos, and there's a couple on here that maybe that you've never seen before. Usually when I do this program, I'll do like an overview of Oceanside history, or I'll do something like the Oceanside Pier, the Oceanside Train Depot, or I'll do an all-encompassing history of Oceanside that's got to cover 100 years. This is just going to be based on the first 50 years, so when it ends at 1938 and you don't see World War II or Camp Pendleton, don't be surprised. If you don't know, Oceanside incorporated July 3rd, 1888. So this year, Oceanside is celebrating its 125th anniversary. And 25 years ago, it seemed so hard to believe that 25 years has passed when we were celebrating our centennial. It all came about because of Andrew Jackson Myers. Andrew Jackson Myers is Oceanside's founder. He came to the San Luis Rey Valley, settled in the 1870s, and applied for a land grant that is now downtown Oceanside. And he received this land grant, 160 acres, and then hired Cave Couts Jr. to subdivide the land, survey it, and lay it out in a town site. And you may have seen this photo. This is a very common photo, but it's one of Oceanside's earliest photos. This is actually the train depot, which is not much more than actually a wooden platform, but this is where the mail would be dropped as early as 1884. So Andrew Jackson Myers applies for this land grant in 1883, receives it in May, and then starts laying out a town site. And as early as 1884, we have our first mail drop, and it's here. This is probably, this is Cleveland looking towards the ocean, and it's probably about 4th Street, or what we call Civic Center Drive. Of course, this is a very common photo and a kind of iconic image of Oceanside. This would be the 100 block of North Cleveland Street. If you know where Harney Sushi is today, this is about where that block is. And this would have been one of the very first buildings. You can see it's up on like probably concrete platforms of some type. And we had the billiard hall, we had and a real estate office and a saloon. Andrew Jackson Myers went about promoting his town, and of course it all had coincided with the name Oceanside, because folks would say, let's go to the Oceanside. And therefore it was very, very easy to name our little town. And the way he went to promote it was to build this bathhouse. And the bathhouse, if you know where the community center is, it's on the Strand. This is about where the bathhouse stood. And he started promoting it in San Diego newspapers, the San Bernardino newspapers, and the Redland newspapers. I checked through some of the newspapers all throughout Southern California, and Oceanside was advertised as a resort city as early as 1885, although there wasn't much there, and this would have been one of the first buildings. This is Andrew Jackson Myers' home. It's not a very good photo, but it's the only image that we have of this shot. And it's really close. If you know where the Civic Center fountain is, right outside our door here, this is where Andrew Jackson Myers' home was built. It was one of the first substantial homes. It was not the first house, but it was one of the more substantial homes, and it stood for until 1927 when it was dismantled. His brother was John Henry Myers, and John Henry Myers built the first hotel. Now, the name of it was originally called the St. Cloud, and here it was named the Hotel Booth. It was named several different names over the years. The Miramar Inn, not to be mistaken with the newer, up-to-date Miramar, and then the Seaside Inn. Maybe some of you might remember it as the Seaside. It was torn down in 1966, but it was a 3-story brick building, not to be confused with the old Travelers Hotel. This is a rare shot, kind of a bleak look at Oceanside, but we're looking at Cleveland Street at 4th Street or Civic Center Drive, and you can see the livery stables here. The Couts family owned this stables. Here is the Bunker House, which is now the Travelers, which is now like I think a spa. But this strip right here, this little dirt path is Cleveland Street. And this would have been about 1886. And here's a close-up then of the Bunker House. The Bunker family came to Oceanside in about 1886, and they built this 2-story home. The downstairs was a general store. Upstairs, was their living quarters, and they also rented rooms. And Theodore Bunker died unexpectedly, and the family moved back to Los Angeles. But this is one of those rare gems that has continued to survive attempts of redevelopment. Things have been torn down in recent years and even in past years, but this lovely building has actually survived. This is another one of the oldest buildings in Oceanside, the Methodist Church. The Congregationalists actually built it in 1886 at the corner of Ditmar and 1st Street, which is now Seagaze. They sold it. They moved to Ramona. Their congregation moved to Ramona, and they sold it to the Methodist Church. And this, I don't have a photo of it in 1886 when it was built, but this photo is actually probably about 1911. And this is just a beautiful lithograph. It's an artist's rendering of what Oceanside was going to look like. And it is actually a very good depiction of some of the layout of Oceanside. Of course, it's an aerial without the benefit of having airplanes. But you can see this little inset is the Oceanside Bank building. This would be the South Pacific Hotel, and back here the Mission. And, of course, the San Luis Rey River going out to the valley. It's very lovely. And then here's the bathhouse on the beach. The only thing that is, in 1887, when this was done, by the way, we did not have a pier. The pier wasn't built until 1888. And I want to point out, in no way was it substantial enough to hold a train and then have enough room for a train to maneuver to turn around. And we never had the shipping vessels. That was always the plan and always the hope, to be able to have it be a wharf, a commercial wharf, but that never panned out. Here's a close-up of that beautiful bank building. It was built in 1887 at 2nd and Hill, or what we call now Mission Avenue and Coast Highway, and it was the northeast corner, the northwest corner. This beautiful building, the story is that it was all done by brick, and they actually had to tear it down, or they didn't have to tear it down. They chose to tear it down in 1924 because they thought it was too old-fashioned. But the story in the newspaper ran when they were building this building that the architect had designed the windows too narrow, and when they went in to put the windows, none of the windows fit actually for the brickwork. And of course now it's brick, what are you going to do? So they had to reorder the windows. But this housed the public library. It housed the city hall. It was obviously a bank. It had a grocery store, the city attorney's office. So at one time, this was a very, very important building to downtown Oceanside. And I really lament its demise because it would have just been a really beautiful building to have in downtown. And of course, this is the South Pacific Hotel. You might have seen this beautiful photo. The South Pacific Hotel was also built in 1887, so a lot of things are happening the year before we incorporate. Oceanside is selling itself as a resort city. We've got the hotel now. We've got the bank building. We've got the bathhouse below. And Melcher Piper, who was one of the managers, built this beautiful landscaped the gardens there, and it was quite expansive. And if you'll see here, right here, there's the opera house. We actually had an opera house. So we had an Oceanside band, we had an orchestra. So we were really trying to sell our city and get people to come. Here's another close-up of that hotel, and you can just see how magnificent it was. 4 stories, and just really, really beautiful. The one thing that you may not know is that it faced the railroad tracks. This is not a view of it looking over the bluff at the ocean. This is it facing the railroad tracks. And the reason that is because the train would stop, and they wanted people to get off the train, and normally those trains would stop for a couple hours, not for 5 minutes or 2 minutes. And they were hoping to entice those train passengers to come in and have dinner or breakfast, and then perhaps stay at the South Pacific Hotel. And then this is a view of Oceanside from the hotel. So this would be Cleveland Street. This is the St. Cloud Hotel, not the Travelers. I believe this then would be 3rd. There's the old schoolhouse up on Horn Street. There's Colonel Horn's house right here. So we're looking east. And of course, there's the original train depot. This is what Oceanside would have looked like from the South Pacific Hotel, probably about 1890, just to kind of give you a view from what the hotel guests would see. This is the schoolhouse building. It was built in 1888, about where the present high school is now, up on Horn and First Street. The Oceanside Lumber Company. This is a great photo. It was on 3rd Street, and of course you might remember the lumber company on 3rd Street for many, many years. It was one of the first businesses to come to Oceanside. At the time they came, it was the Russ Mill Lumber Company, and lumber would have been very, very vital to the building of Oceanside because we needed the wood, the timber to build homes. A lot of times the lumber would come by train. Other times the lumber was actually floated and brought on boats and then floated in. And when they built the pier in 1888, there's descriptions of how instead of sending the lumber by train, it actually was floated off onto ships out on the coast. And you could see, this is a kind of a cool parade. This would be Cleveland Street right here. There's the lumber building that we just looked at right there. And then this is a parade scene coming down Cleveland. They would be traveling south on Cleveland Street. This is a photo of the First Baptist Church, built in 1888. It's still standing. Actually, if you would open these doors, I don't want you to do that right now, but the building is still standing. It's on the corner of 4th and Freeman or Civic Center Drive. And the congregation formed in 1887. They just celebrated their 125th anniversary last year, but the building itself was built in 1888. So it's 125 years. The building over the years has changed uses. It was a mortuary at one time. It was the El Camino Playhouse. It was the Armed Forces YMCA when I came to Oceanside, and now the city is using it for code enforcement. And of course, this is a kind of iconic view of the Oceanside train depot. Our train depot was built by Santa Fe in 1888, and it was all important. So you can see in our incorporation year, a lot of things were being built. Now we've got another church established. Now we've got a depot, and people were thrilled that we now had a Santa Fe train depot. because that meant more than just a loading dock or a platform that maybe the mail was dropped off on. Now we actually had an actual depot. And unfortunately, Oceanside didn't save its depot like a lot of the other small cities like Vista and Carlsbad, and I believe probably maybe Encinitas might have saved theirs as well. But when we had ours rebuilt, or a new one built altogether in 1946, they just tore ours down, unfortunately. Otherwise, we'd have one of those great iconic Santa Fe train depots. This is a great view. I was just thrilled. I think this was one that Randy brought us, was the Colonel Daniel Horn's home on Horn Street. And I've never seen a close-up view of this beautiful home. If you know about where Wendy's is up on Horn Street, this is about where that house stood. Of course, Horn Street is named after Colonel Horn. He came here from Kansas, and he was a prominent businessman. He was involved in the bank and so forth. And he was actually the first president of the city trustees, which would make him the mayor today. He was probably the first mayor of his time, and that would have been in 1888 after we incorporated. This beautiful home stood there all the way up until maybe the 40s or the 50s, and it was actually dismantled, and I think it was the bottom half was moved to Brook Street. And it's still standing there. You just wouldn't be able to tell that it was this beautiful home. This is another great view. I was very excited when Randy Carpenter brought this photo in, because if you've been to one of my programs, especially my peer programs, I've complained and lamented the fact that we did not have a picture of the Oceanside's first pier. And it's very hard to see, but I'll point out some of the things in this photo. We're standing, of course, on the beach. We're looking south. You can see Andrew Jackson's bathhouse and an interesting stairwell down there to the bathhouse. This is the back end of the South Pacific Hotel. And if you look here, this is not, you can see waves, but this is a faint outline of Oceanside's first pier built in 1888. Now, that pier stood until 1891, and this was taken July 4th, 1890. So it's a glimpse. It's the best thing that we have of that look of that first shadow of that pier. If you can see the pilings right there. And so Oceanside's first pier was built, the pilings were built, first set in May of 1888. It got out as far as, I think, 1,500 feet. It was entirely made of wood, and probably one of the reasons it didn't last very long is it was probably too low to the ocean, and we had a great storm. And when one bent goes, or one piling, they have a domino effect. And one would go, and the entire pier eventually went with it. But this is a fantastic photo. I was so thrilled when I saw this. And this is a close-up of the folks at the bathhouse. So you could see the huge, huge crowds. Now, this probably would have been the same day on that July 4th. You can see the back end of the South Pacific Hotel there. And the bathhouse, what was the purpose of the bathhouse? That you could go and actually in these little narrow doors or changing rooms, and you could change into your bathing clothes. And here's an example of a gentleman in what he would wear to go into the ocean. I love the fact that there's a horse on the beach. How he got down there, I'm not quite sure, because you can see that bluff is pretty treacherous. So he would have had to come probably from the San Luis Rey River mouth. And then here's a shot from the bluff. This is Oceanside's second pier, built in 1894. We lost our first pier in 1891, and it was at the end of Count Street, or Wisconsin. And then the Oceanside's second pier the location is moved to the end of 3rd Street, or what we call Pierview Way. And so this is still the bathhouse, still standing there. It's changed a little bit. And then you can see this was called the Little Iron Wharf, because the pilings were made out of iron. And you can see it's kind of rickety there. It doesn't even look to have any railing, so it might have just been in construction. And this would have been the pile driver right here that would have continued to drive the piles to extend it. And the original St. Mary Star of the Sea Catholic Church, built in 1896, just 2 years later. This would have been wonderful for the Catholic parishioners who didn't want to have to travel out to the mission 4 miles, and that would have been sometimes a very treacherous thing, depending on the weather. These were dirt roads, and going down Amit Grade, or what we call Mission, and going down past Rosicrucian now, and then coming back up was sometimes impossible if the roads were muddy. So the Catholic parishioners were thrilled when St. Mary's was built so they could have their own church here in Oceanside. And sadly, in 1896, the South Pacific Hotel burned down, and it was a great tragedy to Oceanside because we lost really, really a beautiful, beautiful landmark, something that was really a tourist draw. And as you can see, the Opera House was saved. There's men on the roof that were hosing it down to keep it from burning. The J.E. Jones Hardware Store. This is a great photo. The J.E. Jones Hardware Store, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, was located on Mission Avenue, 2nd and Freeman originally, if that makes sense. And J.E. Jones came from the Valley. He was a farmer. His father was Eli Jones. The Jones family is still in the San Luis Rey Valley. Many of you might remember his grandson, Davy Jones, was an iconic figure down in the San Luis Rey Valley. This is a great photo, a barber shop, and what I believe this is the Scott barber shop, and he was related to the Couts family. And this is another photo that I believe Randy brought me. And if this is indeed the Scott barbershop, and he had a very elaborate barbershop, Mr. Scott also had the first movie theater. It was called the Elysium Theater. And it was kind of interesting. So if you wanted to go see the movies, the silent pictures, originally it was just a curtain behind his barbershop that you just walked by there. Eventually he built his own storefront for the Elysium Theater. Here's a view of Oceanside. Again, we're still about the 1890. This is looking about from the high school up on Horn Street, looking basically northwest a little bit at a northwest angle. You see the First Methodist Church here. There's the bank building. This is before the hotel burned down, because you can see that in the foreground. The Martin family came to Oceanside from Colorado around the turn of the century, about 1900. And many of you might remember Frank Martin and the Martin's Meat Market. They were an iconic business. I keep saying iconic, but so many of these things are so prevalent and so important in Oceanside's history that when you bring up the name Martin, a lot of people, oh yes, the Martin family. One of the Martins was the mayor of Oceanside. This business was one of the longest running businesses in Oceanside from 1900, I think, and they finally closed in 1983, their last butcher shop. But this would have been located on 2nd Street near Tremont, or what we call Mission Avenue. And luckily for Oceanside, we had a new hotel built. It was 6 years later, actually it would have been 8 years later, the El San Luis Rey Hotel. Many of you might remember the El San Luis Rey as the Colonial Inn or the Beach Hotel. It stood until 1966 when it was torn down. It was later painted white. So many of you might remember and recognize it as a different building. But this was a rustic brown color. It actually it was on Pacific Street, just about the same location as the South Pacific Hotel, but this time it faced the ocean. And it got its name, this is the indoor fireplace, it got its name supposedly, the K.C. Wells was one of the builders, and a newspaper article that I found about him in a biography said that he paid Father O'Keefe $10 for this timber out of the Mission, and he used it for the mantle on the fireplace, so that it was named the El San Luis Rey. The original name on this hotel was going to be the Anchorage, and I don't understand. I think they made a good choice of changing it because we're not in Alaska, but this was just the place to be for a number of years. Here's a view from the pier looking back at Oceanside. You'll see there's the hotel, the El San Luis Rey. The bathhouse is still there. It'll be later replaced the very, very same year with the plunge. And here was the plunge that was built in 1904. The same year, but several months later than the hotel. And the plunge actually had an indoor area where you could go swimming. I think it was for 5 cents, and it was heated water, and it was part of the Oceanside power plant, and that's how Oceanside generated electricity. Here's kind of a panoramic view standing from the bluff. There's the pier, you've got the bathhouse, and you've got there's the bluff there, and there's the stairway, the old stairwell that survived for decades until they finally started making a more substantial stairway for people, because I've heard that it was quite rickety and dangerous at times. The Grace Church was built on Hill Street in 1905. Many of you might recognize it. It was an Episcopal church. They moved it, I believe, in 1948, could have been a little bit later, to West Street, and it was now part of St. Anne's Episcopal Church. But this would have been just another part of the progress of Oceanside as building grew and increased. The George P. McKay's building. This building is still there. If you know where it's called Pierview Coffee Shop, down on Cleveland and 3rd Street or Pierview Way now. It would have been built in 1908. George P. McKay and his wife lived upstairs, and then their general store, and he was also a photographer. So you could buy fishing tackle, you could buy your film if you wanted, you could buy knickknacks. It was like today's souvenir shops, basically. And the first Christian church was built at 1st and Hill Street in 1908. The First Christian Church is one of the oldest congregations. They formed in 1875 out in the San Luis Rey Valley. They say that they're one of the oldest congregations in San Diego County, which is probably true. They had a small church out in the valley, but they came and moved it into Oceanside. They moved their congregation to Oceanside and built this church in 1908. This is a great view. Many of you might remember seeing this. This is actually Oceanside's 3rd pier, which was built in 1903, and it's the passing of the Great White Fleet. And the president sent the naval fleet around the country, and in April of 1908, it was passing Oceanside. So this is a really great view, seeing those ships on the horizon. And the Oceanside Public Library, if you'll remember, they actually were housed in the old bank building that we saw earlier. The Spencer building, which is still standing. I'm not sure exactly what's there right now, but it's on the, I want to say it's on the 400 block of Mission Avenue on the north side. It was built in 1906, and in 1909, the Oceanside Public Library moves into that building. Right here, what you're looking at would be the library with the bookcases. The librarian would have sat at the desk. Not a very big library, but it's managed to live and survive and thrive and continue to grow and expand and serve our community since 1904. The Rosicrucian Fellowship came in 1911, and Max and Augusta Heindel were from Germany. They came scoping out a new headquarter location, found what we call the Rosicrucian grade. Now it was actually owned by a teacher by the name of Amick, A-M-I-C-K, and they bought the land from him overlooking the San Luis Rey Valley. And the Healing Temple, you can still see, it's quite unique and beautiful building you can still see. Has a panoramic view of the San Luis Rey Valley. And at the time, the Rosicrucian Fellowship, it's kind of a mystery to everybody now. We don't know what's going on there. There was a number of historic buildings, and they have taken some of them down. But they had their own printing press. They did a lot of publications here. It was actually quite instrumental. Mrs. Heindel involved herself in a number of things in Oceanside, which included the Beautification Club. They planted trees. She was involved in a lot of civic organizations. So at one time, Rosicrucian Fellowship made quite an impact on Oceanside, and now it's dwindled quite drastically, and there's just a few people that live there. But the people would come for retreats. It was a sanitarium, and of course they had their own religion. The J.E. Jones hardware store, now if you remember the one that I showed you earlier, J.E. Jones built this substantial building then, which is still standing. You might remember it as the Huckabee building. It's on the corner of Hill and Mission, which is now Coast Highway, and I don't even remember what Coast Highway and Mission. You'll have to forgive me because sometimes I want to say the old names and then so people know what I'm talking about. Then if I say the old names and you're new to Oceanside, then you don't know what I'm talking about. So I always try to interchange them and use them both, but I'll trip myself up sometime. This was built in 1912. It's got a full basement. Mr. J.E. Jones had the hardware store down below, and then he rented the offices upstairs. You can see the church right here. That's where that Episcopal church stood. This was built in 1905. I showed you an earlier picture. J.E. Jones actually sold this building, I believe, first. Actually, they rented it to the Howe family, the Howe hardware store, and then later to the Huckabee family. The Huckabees ended up buying it, and it was their department store all the way up until the 1970s. Upstairs was the Silver Slipper Ballroom. This is a great photograph. This is on the corner of 2nd and Hill, or Mission and Coast Highway. If you know where today's contemporary store is, it's called The Closet. It's a young girl's clothing store. This is that corner there. They're waiting for the bus or the transportation. They're waiting for the stage, actually, to take them either to San Diego, maybe take them to the Mission, wherever it was that they were going. I just love the photo. I wish I could zoom in on some of the details. This house right here would have been the old Brody house, later purchased and kind of converted into a store and a gasoline stop. And you can just barely see, there's the gasoline pump right there, just stood right on the curb, and you could fill up. But I just love this. It's called the Coffee Cup. This was probably be about 1918 is my guess, and it was 1918's version of Starbucks. The Mission Garage, this unique building was built on the 200 block of North Hill Street, not just far from here, but they built it, of course, to resemble the Mission, and this unique building stood for a number of years, and you can see it here in this photo. Here's the old bank building. There's the Mission Garage. I love the fact there's so much going on in this photo that's absolutely fantastic. The street sign that would blink red and have directional signs. We've got the old bank building. We've got the El Camino bell. We've got the Mission. I mean, it's just a wonderful, wonderful photo. This was probably taken about a year or two before they tore the bank building down. And, of course, this is then a scene. We're at Cleveland Street, and we're looking up Mission Avenue. So we've got Everett's Grocery Store. We've got the Hayes Land Company. This would be about where Harney Sushi is right now. And then there's the bank building. So we're looking at Mission Avenue. This would be about where Hill Street is right there, Coast Highway. Of course, Merrill's Garage. They were the first Ford dealership, even before Vince Dixon or Dixon Heller. And they were located at 3rd and Hill. And this building, this would be looking down 3rd or Pierview Way. This would be Hill Street. In 1916, Oceanside had a terrible flood. And actually, Oceanside didn't have a terrible flood. San Diego County, Southern California, had a devastating flood. And this is some of the debris that ended up on Oceanside's beach. 4 people from the San Luis Rey Valley were killed and drowned. And roads, bridges, railroads, everything is completely wiped out. You'll see a view of there's the bridge. See the gentleman there looking at the devastation. This is the San Luis Rey Valley, probably taken from, the Rosicrucian. The David Jones Ranch, completely flooded. Now, note that this is the river. You can still see the current. And then the Wackerman family. This is a McCallum photo. Here is one of Oceanside's earliest band shells. This would have been probably about 1919, actually. So that's about when we first got our band shell. We've got the one that we have today was built in 1950, but it was a big thing to have the orchestra or the band playing, and it was just like it is now when there's a concert. It's just kind of the place to be. You've got a great view. You can't beat the view to be able to listen to the music or entertainment. This is an interesting shot. This is the Baptist Church. Now, the Baptist Church was located at 4th and Freeman Street, and in 1906, it was built in 1888. In 1906, they thought it was too far away from downtown, so they picked it up and moved it and put it on Hill Street. So this would be about at the corner of 4th and Hill. And then when World War II came and it was so noisy because there was so much traffic, they picked it up and moved it back to its original location. But this is kind of a great shot because we don't really see this part of Hill Street very often. Aside from this photo, I've never seen the Miramar Garage. So these kind of are just fun photos to see. The Martin Building, built in 1923. This building is still standing, by the way. It just has a different facade. This would be at Mission and Tremont. If you go down this way, of course, this building isn't there, but this, to give you an idea, this is about where Dorothy's Cleaners would be. And this is like a real estate office. This is an aerial of Oceanside about 1923, just to give you an idea. Here is Hill Street, Coast Highway. There's the Huckabee Building, the bank building before it was torn down, the Mission Garage, and of course this would be Mission Avenue. Kind of give you an idea. There's the First Christian Church, there's the Episcopal Church. The Palomar Theater was built in 1924, so we had the Elysium built in 1913, but this is going to be the first building built specifically to have actually have theater seating, a large screen with an organ. Of course, this is before the talkies, but it was quite an addition to Oceanside, and it was built here on Coast Highway, just about where the library is standing right now. Of course, you might remember these. Of course, we know them as Roberts Cottages, but they were actually Clark's Cottages, built in 1924 along the Strand. They're built by the same man who built the Palomar Theater. And here they are as Roberts Cottages. Now, this is the bank building that replaced the beautiful Victorian bank. Again, they tore it down because they thought it was too old-fashioned. They wanted something new and modern. This building is still standing. It houses a T-shirt mart. And although it is quite, I don't know, very, I guess what you would say, modern, it's still an attractive building. And I would one day, I always say this, hope that one day it could be restored, because it would be beautiful in its own right with the beautiful brick and concrete work and the windows. They're under there somewhere. So if the building was to be restored, it would still be quite a nice corner piece for Oceanside. And Oceanside's fourth pier was built in 1927. And this is the grand opening. They had a dedication on July 4th weekend, and this is that dedication. There's a ship called the Percival. I think it was called a destroyer, but somebody since has corrected me on that it was not a destroyer, so I'm just going to say it was called the Percival. It was some sort of naval boat or ship. And this brought, Oceanside had about the time in 1927, we would have had a population of about 2,000, maybe 2,500 people. This celebration brought about 20,000 people over the 3-day weekend. You can see another great shot. You can see how many people are on that pier. They're just packed on the pier. That's just crowds and crowds and crowds. There's a little pavilion underneath. Now, the concrete portion that we see here is the same concrete portion that our pier has today. The pier has been rebuilt since then, but the concrete portion has remained essentially the same. Further construction in 1928, the Bank of Italy built a new bank. Now we know it as Bank of America. This building is still there. It's called Johnson Sporting Goods currently, but it was also A&W, and it was a Oceanside pharmacy as well. Here's another great view of Oceanside. We've got the two banks. We've got the Bank of America. We've got the Bank of Oceanside, the Oceanic Cafe, and we're looking north on Hill Street. Also in 1928, the First Christian Church graduated from their tiny little building, and they built this beautiful building on Freeman Street, and there's the congregation. This church is still standing. Now, Oceanside would have been the home to the Miss Southern California Beauty Contest from the 1920s all the way up to the 1970s. And I believe this is probably about 1931, sometime around there. I know these two girls right here. This is the Helta Bridal twins. And John's aunt is in here somewhere. Isn't that right, John? Where is she at? Right there. There's John's aunt right there. And the Helta Bridal twins were kind of famous in their own right in Oceanside. Number one, they were twins, and they were great swimmers, and they would do the Labor Day pier swim, and they would always win in their division. Here's just kind of a colorized postcard view of the newest band shell. This would probably be sometime in the 30s. We've got the orchestra going on. And as you can see, the cars were essentially just allowed to come down. The strand in this postcard has been paved. It was paved in 1928. but just really another great shot. The old fire station. Now, I know it's a little dark and you can't see, but these actually have doors here that would, big doors that would open this way for the fire trucks. And this fire station is an Irving Gill building. I believe it was built in 1929, if I'm not mistaken. They now call it the Walt Johnson Fire Station. And it was the first building to a permanent fire station building. At times when we had fire equipment, it all had to be stored like at the Oceanside garage on Hill Street. So when this was built, it was Oceanside's first fire station. Here's another view of it. Now the archways have had to be enlarged in order to get modern day fire equipment in there. Because this building is too small, even to take the most up-to-date fire equipment. This is a picture of the Borden building in 1929. Mr. Borden built this right before the Depression. He ended up losing it when the Depression hit Oceanside in the 1930s. But this building remained up until, I think, about 1981. Housed the City Hall offices, housed the library for a time, was the home of the USO. And actually, it was torn down, I think, in 81. It's just a parking lot now. But in the 1940s, it was a nightclub, or part of it was a nightclub called Garrigan's. The J.C. Penney store. The IOOF Lodge built this building in 1924. This building is still there on Mission Avenue. There's Huckabee's right there. J.C. Penney's came to town in 1929, which was quite an addition to Oceanside to have a national department store in downtown. And they actually remained until the mall was built over in Carlsbad. This is just a great shot. Just had to include this. This is at the high school. This is one of the graduations in 1929. Look at the beautiful, beautiful pavilion that they've made, covered in greenery and palm fronds, overlooking the ocean right there. So this would be on the school grounds, and they're getting ready for the 1929 high school reunion. The Americanization School was another Irving Gill building. You might recognize this building. It was built in 1931. It's still standing in the Crown Heights neighborhood. In the 1980s, it was set for demolition, and the city and the redevelopment agency and the Historical Society helped to have it rebuilt or refurbished. And it's working now as a neighborhood center. The Oceanside Hospital, this was Oceanside's first hospital. This house, by the way, is still standing. It's on the 600 block of North Freeman Street. It is now converted into apartments. But this would have been where Oceanside, actually an emergency hospital. And because of the highway, there was many, many accidents. Up north, it was called Slaughter Alley. And if there was an accident, it was usually deadly. And this is the time before seatbelts were mandatory and probably even highway speeds. So if there was an accident, it was quite deadly. And Oceanside really was ill-equipped to take care of some of those. And this first hospital was maintained by Golda Lester, who would later marry Ellis Zanheiser. We had another maternity hospital. This would have been on Mission Avenue. Many of you might remember Cottage City. This was just south of where Roberts Cottages is. Not to be mistaken by Roberts Cottages, because these were wooden buildings, not the stucco buildings that we saw earlier. And these remained probably up until the 1970s, I believe. The City Hall and Public Library was designed, another Irving Gill building. Of course, now we know this as the Museum of Art. This photo is not one of my best photos, but it's the post office. Oceanside didn't have a post office building of its own. The post office was another different storefronts over the years, and it wasn't until 1936 that we got our own official post office building that was built by WPA funds. And then in 1938, we finally got our own hospital. This hospital building, you might know, is a recovery center now up on Horn Street near Summit or Fifth. I don't even know what they call Fifth. I think they call it Sport Fisher. And then this would have been a very needed hospital. Actually, the residents, the local doctors, Mrs. Zanheiser donated most of her money, but actually she got the residents of Oceanside to donate $6,000, which would have been a huge sum back in 1938 to help build this hospital. Of course, in 1938, Oceanside still promoting itself as a resort city. This was a publicity photo. These girls are not fisher women. They're in their waders and their fishing poles, and the Chamber of Commerce actually sent this out as far as even the East Coast just to kind of celebrate the bathing beauties and the beauty of Oceanside, if you will. And this is another great view of the Southern California Beauty Contest in 1938. A little girl's getting up there, probably maybe to sing the Star-Spangled Banner. You see her, she's there standing on a chair getting ready to sing. And then 1938, Miss Oceanside was Norma Ellis. And Norma Ellis graduated from Oceanside High School, and then you can see her. The thing I like about this photo is the runway, again, is covered in palm fronds. This was an annual event, and it usually coincided with a beach opening. And in 1938, now, of course, this is the first 50 years of Oceanside. One of the other things that was happening in 1938, that Oceanside was celebrating the new Highway 101 linking up to Orange County. So we've got Norma Ellis, and another gal from San Clemente, and they are participating in the big celebration. Leo Carrillo was there, the governor of California. This was a huge link. They repaved, re-widened the road that would connect Orange County, supposedly to Oceanside, but of course you were still going through the Rancho Santa Margarita Ranch. And then Norma Ellis was also in this publicity photo for the Chamber of Commerce, where life is worth living was a slogan that was pushed by the Oceanside Chamber of Commerce. And that's kind of where 1938, the first 50 years, kind of leaves us here, is bringing us all the way up. And the next 50 years, we spent our first 50 years promoting Oceanside, a lot of building, a lot of development. And the next 50 years, if you will come to that program, we're going to kind of talk about how the building of Camp Pendleton, the coming of Camp Pendleton, kind of changes this from that sleepy little beach town and really kind of forces us to grow up, if you will, in a whole new way. If you didn't know that we have a small museum and office located at 305 North Nevada, we're right around the corner from the fire station. We hope to be open on Thursdays and Fridays, and we are looking for volunteers. So if you have an interest in volunteering at our Historical Society, we've got some forms in the back. The other thing that we've done, if you haven't taken advantage of one of our history walks, we're going to start a downtown history walk in April. We meet at the Civic Center fountain at 9 o'clock. The walks are free, and they take about 2 hours. And it's a great way just to kind of, and if you've been to the program now and you go on the walk with either John or myself, and we talk about some of these buildings and some of these locations, we kind of get more in depth. We actually go to some of these sites, and it might just maybe make it a more interesting or more appealable to you. And I don't know if you have any questions. I'm sorry we had such a late start. And I hope that I didn't bore you with my photographs. But if you have any questions, I'd love to answer any that you might have. Yes?
Really quickly, the cause of the fire and then the cause of the flood.
Yeah, the cause of the fire at the South Pacific Hotel in 1896, the rumor is that a lady up on the third or fourth floor had an old-fashioned curling iron, not the kind that you could plug in, obviously, but the kind that you would put in like a lantern, and that would heat it up, and then you could curl your hair. And that got knocked over. The kerosene started a fire. And when the Oceanside Fire Department got to the hotel, they realized that their hose and their ladder would not reach up to where the fire was. So they had to just watch it burn down. No one was hurt. They actually got a lot of the furnishings out. But it was a big lesson for Oceanside because it was a huge thing to lose that hotel. But we weren't the only one that lost the hotel. Carlsbad lost a hotel that year, as well as, I believe, La Jolla. And so there was a talk that maybe somebody was committing arson because they happened like one right after the other in 1896. What was the other question? Oh, what caused the flood? Well, one of the rumors was that there was a man by the name of Hatfield, and he was a rainmaker, and we were desperate for rain. And the county actually hired him to produce rain. Now, whether you can actually produce rain or not, or if it's just one of those acts of God or Mother Nature, probably more like it. But it rained for a number of days without stop. And really, it just continued to rain. There was nowhere else for the water to go. The ground was saturated. And by the time the mountains up there flooded, and then the river floods, and it's bringing all of that debris and all of that water down, it just wiped out the valley, and it wiped out the bridges. You know, they said that trees from Palomar Mountain were on the beach at Oceanside. That's how powerful it was. And it just didn't impact Oceanside, it impacted all of Southern California. Are there any other questions? Yes?
Capital, of course, got blamed for that.
Yes.
And subsequently had to speak out of town very rapidly.
He did. They wanted to sue people, the different cities and the county wanted to sue him for the damages, and he actually left town. And there's a movie called The Rainmaker, and for the life of me, I can't remember who's in it, if somebody wants to help me. And that was based on the life, I'm sorry? Burt Lancaster. And that was actually based on that incident. Yeah. Yes?
Could you talk just a little bit about historic preservation? At first, I was really surprised to hear about all the stuff that's been left down.
Right. It's really kind of funny what, if these are privately owned buildings, then of course everybody has the right. Now there's a planning commission. Before there was no planning commission. If you wanted to tear down a building, you tore down your building. Now there's a planning commission, and there's a process that you have to go through. We're at the time redevelopment funds. So if you were in the redevelopment area and you had a historic property, then there was an incentive perhaps to save your building, restore your building, have your building retrofit. And of course it adds to the charm and the character of downtown. But there was a mindset, and sometimes I still think there is, not just in Oceanside, but everywhere, that newer is better. And of course, sometimes things are so cost prohibitive. As you know, the Mission San Luis Rey has to be retrofitted at the cost of millions of dollars. And it's a 215-year-old building, or the church was built in 1812, I think. But, it's cost prohibitive to have to kind of retrofit those things. There's no state laws. No, number one, a house or a building would have to be deemed historical, have to have landmark status. So someone have to go through the process of having it deemed landmark status, either on a state level or a national level. But I will tell you that the skating rink down on Cleveland Street was given state landmark status, and it was still torn down, because what can be done can be undone. And when you're talking about dollars and people wanting to develop that property, it can sometimes speak louder than that. Yes?
Two-part question. One is, what's going to happen with the old Top Gun house?
Mm-hmm.
And part two is, did Oceanside have any famous ghosts?
Well, the Top Gun house would be one, wouldn't it? The Top Gun house was actually, built in about 1887. It was the Graves house. It was built by a doctor from inland. And if you don't know where it's at, it's the little cute blue house on Pacific Street in Seagaze. It used to be First. And it was in the famous movie with Tom Cruise, The Top Gun. And what's going to happen with that is that building will be restored eventually, and it's very heartbreaking to see it just sit there and crumble, because it breaks my heart. But when the newest hotel project comes in, they're going to incorporate that house into the new hotel project. So it's going to stay on Pacific Street, but it's probably going to move a block and a half north, and they're going to probably maybe have it be like a coffee shop, a souvenir shop, something like that. And the developer has already talked publicly about that. SOHO, Save Our Heritage organization, has recognized this building as very historic. It's one of the few, if not the only, folk Victorian house, and still standing in its original location. So it's very, very historic. We have the backing of SOHO, so that building will be saved. Are there any other questions? Yes.
You didn't say anything about the ghost.
Oh, the ghost. You know what? The ghost, I don't know of any ghosts, to tell you the truth, but if you go down to the Hunter restaurant, the Hunter restaurant was built on top of a cemetery. And this Buena Vista Cemetery, it was the South Oceanside Buena Vista Cemetery. And in 1970 or 1969, they supposedly moved bodies to make way for that restaurant. They moved 17 bodies, but there was probably as many as 50 people buried there. And over the course of grading and excavating, they ran into another probably dozen or so bodies. And even in the 1990s, you know where the bike shop is right next to the Hunter? That used to be a gas station. And when Chevron had to do some checking or removing of those oil, whatever they call them, I'm sorry, I'm not technical, Um, they found 6 more remains. Eternal Hills actually called me and told me because they accepted the remains. So who knows? So they will say that the hunter has some ghosts there. So, yes.
The old Bank of Italy building where the sporting goods now, was the architect for that Julia Morgan?
You know, I don't know that for sure if she was. I think it was rumored that she was, and then someone recanted. John might be able to tell you. I think we do know who the architect was. I just don't have it on the top of my head right now. But I have a newspaper article that gives the architect. So if you want to see me afterwards, I could get your email and email you the info. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you know if the mayor, Jerry Jones, was any relation to the J.E. Jones?
No, not the same Jones family. Yeah. Yes, sir.
The original guy, the Myers, how did he make his money to buy the 160 acres?
Well, actually, he did not have to buy that. You could actually apply for a land grant. And so the United States actually, if there was certain criteria that you had to meet. I think you had to be a U.S. citizen, maybe you had to be a naturalized citizen, and then you had to say there was certain criteria that you were going to do with that land. You were going to develop that land or live on that land for a number of years. So that was actually awarded to him. He was just a farmer. Now, he lost what money he did make on Oceanside. He was a gambler. He was a drinker. His house that you saw was actually, the Couts family actually owned and foreclosed on that home. And he died probably a very poor man. He would actually box people on the street for money. So he was a character. Yeah. Well, did you have another question? Okay. Did somebody? Yes.
You mentioned the Couts family. Is that the same family that established
Yes, the same Couts family. Cave Couts and Isadora Bandini Couts lived at Rancho Guajome, and so it would have been Cave Couts Jr. that would have laid out and surveyed the town and made the original streets. And then John Chauncey Hayes was then the real estate agent who originally sold all of those lots. And we saw a photo of his early real estate office. Yes.
Any recommendations on books that talk about the history of Oceanside?
I'm glad you asked. We do have a we do have a book. The Historical Society did a book about 12 years ago called Oceanside, Where Life is Worth Living, and it has a history. It's for sale back there for $25, and if you don't want to spend $25, I'd love for you too, because it supports the Historical Society. But we have a free magazine back there that the Oceanside Chamber did that gives the history from 1888 all the way up to the present. It's got a timeline and photos and things like that. So yes. Yes, the original St. Mary's Church is called now the Lemon Street Chapel, and they moved it to the East Side neighborhood, and it's still there. It's on Lemon Street. It's still intact, and for years they used it for catechism classes and different ceremonies that the East Side families would participate in. Yes?
What was down in the valley during the first 50 years of Oceanside besides the mission?
Well, it would have been mostly just farming, but there was they had their school down there. There was a Libby school. There was a San Luis Rey school. There would have been a number of dairies, probably maybe 8 to 10 dairies down in the valley, and then a number of ranchers. And then, of course, they had their 2 different cemeteries aside from the mission. And even before Oceanside came into being, there was a little township that was just west of the Mission San Luis Rey buildings, and it was called the San Luis Rey Township. It had its own newspaper, it had a store, the Gold Bomb store, and it had a hotel. And in fact, the Frank Whaley from San Diego fame and the Whaley House down at Old Town was the first editor of the San Luis Rey Star, which later became the Oceanside Star, which later became the Oceanside Blade, which Blade Tribune, and here we are. I don't know what we are anymore. But that's a little bit of that story. And the first hotel that we had down, it was called the Lock House, L-O-C-K-E. And they actually picked up the Lock House and moved it 4 miles and put it on Cleveland Street and called it Tremont. But the Lock House moved to Oceanside.
Move everything around with horses?
Isn't that crazy? You know what? They would have had to move it with horses. It would have been quite a feat, again, coming up that hill. I can't even imagine. But they probably would have cut it up into sections and brought it that way. Yeah. Any other questions? I thank you so much for your time and attention. I really do. Thank you. And I'll be available for questions afterwards if you have any. And thank you so much for coming.